Greetings paddlers, Bill Dawes here from supboardguide.com, and today I'm going to be talking to you about paddleboarding safety, you can be safe on the water. This is actually what I do for a living. I'm a National Safety Officer for New Zealand stand-up paddleboarding, and essentially my job is to find out why people get into trouble and then how to educate them so that they don't get into trouble. So today we're going to be covering off on the 4 cornerstones of paddleboarding safety so that you don't get into trouble. There's a whole lot to say about paddleboarding safety. It's a big topic. So I've been working in it for many years now full time, and I've realized the complexity of it to the point actually where I've ended up writing some books about it, which you can get on Amazon. Just follow the links below. And I will be referring to the books a few times through this video because there is more to say on any of the topics than we can really cover off in one quick hit. But I'm going to start with the first cornerstone, the first pillar of paddleboarding safety. Okay. Now this actually happens before you've left home. It's the day before. You're thinking about going paddleboarding, you've got to do some preparation, you've got to do some planning. Okay. Most importantly, you've got to know what the weather's going to do. This is really important. You need to know what the wind is doing, how strong it's going to be, and for which direction it's going to be blowing, because that can have a real big impact on where you're actually going to go and paddle. You don't want to be paddling somewhere where the wind is going to blow you way offshore, and you don't want to be paddling in too much wind. So to get this information, you need to actually understand how to read a weather forecast. I mean, you need a weather forecast that will give you how the wind looks throughout the day, both in strength and direction. And you need to know what that actually means. It's no good just saying, hey, it says 10. 10 what? Some forecasts give it in knots, some give it in miles an hour, some give it in meters per second, some give it in kilometers an hour. 10 kilometers an hour wind is very, very different to 10 meters a second as a wind. So you need to understand this stuff, okay? There's a lot of knowledge required in being able to interpret a weather forecast. Other factors that can be significant, the temperature, that's going to determine what you're going to wear. Clouds and rain, again, that can have a major impact. So understanding the weather forecast in advance is the first step of planning. And actually, hey, you never know, it might be that you look at the forecast and go, well, we ain't going paddleboarding tomorrow. The weather is not right, okay? The worst thing you can ever do is just chuck your board in the truck and go down to the beach not knowing what to expect. That's a recipe for disaster. So that's one aspect of preparation. If you're paddling on the coast, you need to know what the tides are doing, because a beach can look totally different at high tide to low tide, and most importantly, the tides also determine when the currents are at their strongest. Currents are a big deal in paddleboarding safety. Currents probably account for more problems than anything else. Okay? People getting caught in a strong current and taken out to sea, or indeed if you're paddling on rivers, then currents, if the river current is too strong, then that causes a lot of people to get into difficulties. So you need to research and know what the current's going to be doing when you're actually out there on the water. Other aspects of preparation that might be required and planning, if you're going somewhere you've never paddled before, where are you going to park? Are there any facilities there? Do you need a permit to actually get on the land there? If you're paddling from A to B, how are you going to make that work? Who's going to pick you up at the other end? There's a bit of time spent planning and preparing is a really, really smart start to your paddleboarding session, and it only needs to take a couple of minutes. It's not a big deal, but when you've got the hang of it, it makes all the difference. Likewise, your equipment, is it actually ready to go? Is it fit for purpose? If you are going to paddle somewhere new, like for example, you're a lake paddler and you're going to go and paddle a river at the weekend, have you got the right gear? Think about that in advance. There's no point getting up on Saturday morning to go paddle on the river and then realizing, oh, hey, I haven't got a quick release leash. Get your equipment sorted first, make sure it's all in good condition so you're ready to go. So that's planning and preparation, and it's a massive, massive part of paddleboarding safety. The second cornerstone of paddleboarding safety is your knowledge of the environment. Now this is going to take a bit of time to learn, but I really implore that every time you go paddleboarding, think about it. Okay, when you're out there on the water, watch what's happening around you, think about what the weather's doing all the time, because it's a really changeable environment, and those changes can bring in some real big safety implications. Okay. So when you first get to the water's edge, first thing to think about is the environment actually what you expected? Now, if that weather forecast that you looked at said it's going to be 0 wind, and you get there and the water's choppy and windy and the trees are moving around, then clearly the forecast was wrong. In this case, you've got to trust your eyes, okay? And you've got to make a judgment. Now, okay, that looks too windy. But there's more to the environment than just the water state or the weather, but these are probably the most important things. But also other factors in the environment that have a really big safety implication are, for example, other water users. You may get to the water's edge and actually there's a whole bunch of boats out today, far more than you're expecting, and all these boats are whizzing around and you think, no, this environment is not safe. Okay. And another major factor in the environment to consider are the other water users of a non-human kind. There's kind of two different groups there. There are creatures, this is particularly if you're in the ocean, but there are freshwater creatures as well that you really don't want to encounter. Okay. There have been instances of shark attacks on paddleboards. If you have the knowledge of what to do, you won't become a statistic. But knowing where those sharks are is probably a smart thing to do. And there are plenty of other creatures that can cause you a problem. But then again, there are also the creatures like dolphins or whatever that are really cool to see. But there are actually rules on how you interact with them. So again, this all kind of comes back to understanding your environment. But primarily, the two big factors in understanding the environment are the wind conditions and the water conditions. As I said, the more you go paddling, the more you will understand what is safe. But you really need to be watching it the whole time, keeping an eye on it, seeing if it's changing, and thinking about whether those changes are going to affect you. There's a whole lot more information on this in the books, as there is indeed on the first cornerstone of planning and preparation. So take your time, read it through, and think about how it's going to affect you next time you go paddleboarding. The third cornerstone pillar of paddleboarding safety is knowing what to do when things go wrong, which can happen and does happen. And often it's not having that knowledge that will change the situation from being actually pretty easy to deal with through to becoming a full-blown emergency. Now, in many walks of life, for the emergency services or indeed any professional service where they have to deal with problems, they will practice this. They'll practice it over and over and over again so that actually when the emergency happens for real, the training kicks in and they know what to do. Now, I'm not suggesting we go out there and practice all our emergencies on paddleboards, but having just thought about it a bit before and having a plan will make all the difference, because when you're actually in an emergency situation, it's really hard to think straight then. So if you've done this thinking before, maybe with some other paddling friends over a coffee or a glass of wine or whatever. And indeed, in the book, there is a whole lot of information about this. So let's just kick it around a little bit. There are basically 3 types of problems that you might encounter when you're out paddleboarding. You might have a problem with your equipment. There might be an environment issue whereby things have changed. Or indeed, it might be a problem with you, a health issue. Let's start with equipment. The good news with paddleboarding is that there is not a lot that can go wrong in a really dramatic fashion. We can deal with pretty much anything that gets thrown at us in paddleboarding, unlike a lot of the more kind of kinetic water sports like windsurfing or kite surfing, where if something goes wrong, it can go wrong in a big way at high speed and you can get badly hurt. Paddleboarding equipment problems tend to be a little bit easier to deal with. There are many things that could happen, but I'll just take a couple of examples. Okay, so what would you do if your paddle snaps? Okay, this is a really common scenario. Lots and lots of paddles snap, but it actually doesn't need to be a major problem. Now, if you're with other people, no problem. Someone else could just take you under tow. If you're on your own, hopefully you might be able to retrieve the bottom part of your paddle, in which case no problem, just sit down and use that to paddle home. Indeed, you'd be surprised, you could even just use the handle section and you can get a bit of a way with that. If you've lost your paddle completely, then you could just lay on the board and paddle with your hands, or kneel and paddle with your hands. So these are easy solutions, and you're probably thinking right now, well, yeah, I would have thought of all that. But actually, I promise you, in an emergency, there are many cases of people whose paddle snapped and they didn't think of this stuff because they panicked. Considering something before it happens is the best possible thing you can do. So that's just one example of an equipment problem that might happen. Okay. Now, Other problems, the environment problems. A classic one here is that the sea suddenly gets a whole bunch more choppy and so you're struggling, or the wind strength picks up and now you're struggling to paddle against it. Now, if you have really got your second cornerstone of paddleboarding safety sorted, you'd have spotted that change in the environment happening and you'd have taken action early, because there's almost nothing that happens in weather instantly. Okay, there's normally some warnings if you know what to look for, and you would have seen that the wind was picking up. But let's just say, hey, you didn't, you were distracted, or you weren't really paying attention, and the wind suddenly got stronger, and now you're struggling to get back. Okay, so first thing in this situation, always, I'm just going to use this as an example to work through. What are you going to do? You're going to try and paddle by kneeling down or even laying down and see if you can make headway against the wind like that. Hopefully that's going to make a bit of difference. You're going to paddle to the nearest point of land or the nearest point of shelter where you can get out of the wind. And again, this might just seem really obvious, but every year there are countless cases of people who get caught out because they didn't realize that it was as simple as that. Okay, get down low, reduce your windage, paddle hard, paddle deep, and just get yourself towards the nearest point of land. Forget about trying to get back to your destination, just get to safety, and then you can play it from there. Okay, so that's just one example of things that might change in the environment, but having thought about it beforehand, having a plan. Indeed, when you're even out there on the water, you're paddling along and just thinking, okay, I'm a little bit exposed here. If the wind was getting up, where would I go? Okay, I would probably just head for that beach there if the wind gets up. Thinking like this keeps you safe. And then finally, the other group of problems that could happen are with you. Something goes wrong with you. Maybe you just end up feeling a bit ill and you're aware that you're going down with some nasty bug or whatever. If ever you're feeling ill in the first place, don't go paddleboarding to start with. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. But if you're out there in the water and you suddenly start feeling a bit crook, what would you do? Have a think about that. This is why it's so important to carry communications. Likewise, it might be a sudden injury. You slip off your board, you fall awkwardly, you dislocate your shoulder, something like that. You can't see that coming, very hard to prepare for that, but actually having a plan on what you would do will still make all the difference. Or it could be something, another thing that has occurred to a lot of paddleboarders around the world is they've been out paddling and they've just suddenly been stung by a bee or a jellyfish and they end up having an anaphylactic reaction. Again, in any situation like this, one of the best things that could possibly happen is you've got another paddler with you. Paddling in a group is always going to be safer than paddling on your own. But you know, if you are prone to anaphylactic reactions, then again, having thought about this beforehand is going to make all the difference. So this is a really important cornerstone of paddleboarding safety. What could go wrong? Thinking about it, having a plan before it happens will change it from an emergency into just, I know what to do, I'll deal with this. As said, again, this is covered in great detail in the book, but hopefully this has just given you an idea of the sort of stuff that could happen and how you deal with it. The last cornerstone of paddleboarding safety is, and this is perhaps what you've been expecting me to say right throughout this video, is your safety equipment. Okay. Now, safety equipment is really, really important, but still, safety equipment is effectively a kind of a last line of defense. It's your insurance for where other stuff has gone wrong. Actually, if you do proper preparation and planning, if you understand the environment and you know what to do when things go wrong, it may well be that you never even need your safety equipment, but you're still going to have it just in case. Okay. Plus which there's also the very relevant point that many people end up using their safety equipment because they encounter someone else who's in trouble, not them. So always good to have. Now we've got 4 specific items of safety equipment. First and foremost is the leash. Something to attach you to the board, because about the worst thing that can possibly happen is losing your board. That's a real serious problem right there, and sadly that does account for quite a few paddleboarding fatalities every year around the world. People get separated from their board and then you're in a whole lot of trouble. So let's not get separated from our board, okay? Wear a leash. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simple as that, because there are a bunch of different types of leashes and there is no one leash that is right for all conditions. So there's a bit more you need to know about that. This is all covered in the books and also in our other safety video purely about safety equipment. Okay, but take it away. Most importantly, don't ever go paddleboarding without an appropriate leash for the conditions. The next SUP is some flotation, a buoyancy aid, a PFD, whatever you want to call it. We're not talking about what is technically known as a life jacket, which will keep your head above the water. It's got all the flotation up there. They're great, but they're not good for paddleboarding because they're not comfortable, okay? So most paddleboarders will wear a buoyancy aid that has buoyancy here to keep you afloat, or indeed the inflatable type. I said we cover those in much more detail in the safety equipment video. Some paddlers say, hey, I don't need a buoyancy aid. That's not smart. You never know if you're going to not need a buoyancy aid. If something goes wrong on the water, you get injured or whatever, having a buoyancy aid is going to save your life. And look at this little guy right here. This is not ruining my life strapping this on around my waist, okay? There are plenty of really good buoyancy aids for paddleboarding. There are options for every sort of paddleboarder. Having a buoyancy aid is just smart. Yeah. The third aspect of safety equipment is actually probably the most important, because if you're getting blown out to sea by a strong wind, or you're getting taken out to sea by a strong current or something like that, it's not going to be your leash or your buoyancy aid that's going to save you. It's going to be being able to call for help. So carrying your phone in a waterproof case, or having a VHF or a locator beacon or other methods for communication are real lifesavers. Again, also that scenario I mentioned earlier, you come around a corner and there's somebody in trouble in the water, being able to call for help is actually, a really, really big deal. And an awful lot of the rescues that happen around the world are purely because the person was able to call for help. So having some communications is a really important part of your paddleboarding safety. Obviously, if you're just messing around in your local lake, which is half an acre big, and there's people all around it, you're not going to be needing to carry a locator beacon. But still, even then, what's the best way to attract the attention of someone on shore? Having a bit of knowledge about paddleboarding communications equipment is really important. And last, but very much not least, the final aspect of your safety equipment is what you're wearing. Your PPE, a phrase we all know now. Everything you wear can have a safety implication. If the water's cold, if you're not dressed appropriately, that can be seriously dangerous. But equally, if you're overdressed and it's too hot, equally dangerous. Protecting yourself from the sun, protecting your feet or your body from wear and tear when you're out there. Everything you wear has a safety implication, okay? And getting that wrong can have, cause major problems. So there you have it. Those are the 4 items of safety equipment that every paddleboarder really should have. You need an appropriate leash, you need an appropriate form of flotation, buoyancy aid, you need appropriate communications, and you need to be wearing the right stuff. Okay? So this is all covered in much more detail in our next video. So there you have it, the 4 cornerstones of paddleboarding safety. And if you pay attention to all those 4 cornerstones, you're going to be safe, all right? Plan and prepare before you even left the house. Really, really important. Know what's going to happen with the conditions. When you're out there on the water, learn to understand the conditions, think about what's going on around you, and again, it will make a major difference. You're not going to get caught out. But sometimes you will still get caught out, so give a bit of thought to what you would do if things go wrong. And last but very much not least, make sure you've got the right type of safety equipment for the environment you're going to be paddling in. Okay, well, I hope you found that video useful. So we have another video which will cover the safety equipment in much more detail. But if you like the video, please like it, subscribe to our channel because we've got lots more really good information about paddleboarding, safety, and all other aspects of the sport. Happy paddling.